So, hello. Today we are talking with Saskia Stachovic. Saskia Stachovic is a senior research fellow and senior visiting fellow at the Central European University, now in Vienna. And she is also a principal investigator of the project Risky Borders, Gender and Race in EU Border Security. So today we're going to discuss exactly that. We're going to discuss EU borders, we're going to discuss EU border security, and also relate it a little bit to the ongoing refugee crisis in Ukraine. So without further ado, maybe I will start with the first question. Saskia, first of all, thank you very much for agreeing for this interview. I know you're super busy these days, but it's great that you found time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so let me just maybe start with this overall question. How do you perceive this situation, the war in Ukraine, and the impact it has on the EU in terms of refugees from Ukraine? What does it all mean? How many came to the EU? What is happening these days?
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. As for the situation right now, I think the numbers of June 1st tell us that almost 7 million people have been displaced. Due to the Ukrainian conflict. That is about 17% of the Ukrainian population, which is massive. Most of these refugees have gone, or the largest part of them have gone to Poland, followed by Romania. Many have also gone to Russia. It is not so easy to say how many have come into the EU because different countries report on this differently, but you can already see that some of the larger countries, or some of the countries that have taken in a larger proportion of the refugees, are within the EU. Hungary is also one of the bigger receiving countries.
Okay, and so how did you perceive maybe the EU's response to this situation? Was it solidar with Ukraine or not, and how did it then manifest?
Well, the EU has granted people displaced from Ukraine a specific protective status. So Ukrainian refugees can stay within the EU for at least a year now, and the status can be extended. And the EU has also made special funds available to member states for dealing with the situation. So they have overall reacted quickly and in solidarity, and have at least provided the conditions upon which it would be fairly easy for member states to receive and then also to host these refugees.
Mm-hmm. Let me now come to the specific topic of your research. You've done a lot of research on Frontex, the EU border agency, and this exactly relates to how actually Ukrainians in this case, or generally any other nationals of any other states, cross into the European Union, and what do they face while they're doing that, right? So can you maybe explain what Frontex does and how it fared before, and maybe what the current situation means for this agency?
Well, Frontex is an agency that has been set up in 2004 already, first as a coordinating body between national border guards, EU level, and the various actors that are involved in securing and managing the external borders of the EU. And since then, the agency has seen a large boost in its mandate, in its resources, its staff. So in 2016 and then again 2019, it has received more capabilities and more responsibilities. This is the larger trend. And this is also despite the fact that the agency has been heavily criticized repeatedly. Various scandals around fraud and internal problems, but also most prominently scandals around pushbacks and human rights violations, where Frontex has at least been in the know or even part of these pushbacks. And now just recently the director, Fabrice Leggeri, has resigned over some of these allegations. So that is the larger trend. Frontex is partly active with regards in supporting specific member states, but also Moldova, for example, in handling the situation. They are also active they claim, but this is one of the main things they do, that they provide daily updates and briefings and informations and monitoring of the situation. So they are relevant, but they are not in all the member states and dealing with this situation equally. So as always, they would only go where member states need additional assistance.
You also mentioned this practice of pushbacks and the criticism levied against Frontex. So can you maybe explain a little bit what it means, and are pushbacks still happening? Is it something that's been stopped since it's become such a widely known problem?
Well, that is impossible for me to say whether it has stopped. A pushback is an illegal act, and this is not allowed. And for years, we've already known that Frontex has at least been looking onto these practices. And now we're having more and more evidence as we progress that Frontex is also, Frontex officers, Frontex employees have always been part of this practice. So it is very hard to say. We have known it for a long time and it hasn't stopped. So I wonder if our new knowledge is now going to put an end to the practice. Certainly there will be more scrutiny. The question will be, what does that mean for how we perceive and treat Frontex, and whether we are still going forward with the massive extensions that are in the planning for this agency.
And how does the EU argue, why do we need these massive extensions?
Well, if you have followed the debates around migration in the last decade probably, but certainly since 2015, we have seen that a growth of Frontex was always one of the main crisis solutions that political leaders have come up with. So externalization of migration is one of the bigger projects that has been one of the answers to the challenges. And then in association with that, a buildup of Frontex.
So why do we, because you are specializing also on analyzing various policies through a feminist lens, right? And you try to integrate gender perspective in that. Why is gender perspective actually relevant to the issues of migration and in Frontex in particular?
Well, for various reasons. A very obvious reason is that migration is a gendered phenomenon, right? It does not affect men and women equally. It does lead to different practices, to different policies. It does lead to different risks and insecurities for men and women. And for trans people, for queer people, it does have gendered effects on differently gendered people. That is one of the reasons why we always need to look at these bigger social phenomena through a gendered lens. But then a feminist perspective asks us to go further and to develop a critique in our understanding of security, asking, what is security? What do we perceive of the object of security? Who do we perceive as threat? Who do we perceive as a legitimate protector? And this is all very relevant, especially in the field of migration, where security can refer to very different objects and subjects. And probing into that and looking into what kind of security do we prioritize, and what kind of insecurities come from that, almost inevitably, if we center the security of borders, of territories, of states, of institutions, we're producing insecurities for people very often. And feminists claim that we cannot understand these discussions as separate.
So I guess it's very also relevant to the research that you conducted a couple of years ago on Frontex and how Frontex analyzes risks. What does risk mean for how they perceive the risk for the EU, right? So what were your findings, and how did this gender outlook on this situation, maybe how does it change our perception of risk?
The work that you're referring to is part of a larger research project, the one that you mentioned in the intro, that has been going on for a year now, and we will continue for at least 2 more years with this specific project. So we're arguably at the beginning, but the idea of the project is to not look to operational practices at the border, to look at pushbacks, for example, but to take a step back and look at how does an institution understand risk, where does this knowledge and this understanding evolve, and what kind of consequences does it have institutionally and on the ground. And with regards to gender specifically, we wanted to shift the focus a little bit to this problem construction. So how is migration understood as a problem? How does Frontex, but also other actors, generate that kind of understanding of a problem? And what does that then lead to? And our initial findings is that Frontex draws quite heavily on gendered and racialized understandings of who migrants are, what they do, why they are risky, why they are also at risk. So we're also seeing a production of a humanitarian discourse that is also, of course, closely linked to several gendered stereotypes. So drawing on these stereotypes, drawing on strong dichotomies between European, non-European, and using these stereotypes, if you will, that are already embedded in society, using that to justify particular bordering practices in surveillance, in returns, and also with regards to humanitarian practices, and then a broader legitimization of the growth of Frontex. So the understanding of the masculinized economic migrant, or the understanding of the feminized refugee in need of protection. These are logics that produce understandings of deservingness and undeservingness, and then lead into particular knowledge, security, and management practices.
So, as I understand, your work on this research project started shortly after 2015. In the aftermath of this migration crisis, as we usually refer to it, on the southern border of the European Union. So what maybe now we are facing another crisis on the eastern border. So how do these two situations compare, maybe, or if it's actually helpful to compare them at all?
Well, I think it's enlightening to compare them, especially if we think about what I just said around gender and race as these sense-making categories that help us to understand, make sense of migration, and then politically have consequences in how we deal with it. So I think here we're seeing, with the current situation, we're seeing a lot of productions of gender deservingness, right? We're understanding Ukrainian refugees mostly through the lens of women and children. We're understanding them as vulnerable. We understand them as like us. So there's a lot of discourse around the Europeanness of these migrants, and this feeds into discourses that that enable a lot more, or a lot less oppressive bordering practices than we have seen in 2015, 2016, where the production largely, the discursive production largely evolved around refugees being very much not like us, and being perceived as heavily masculinized phenomenon. And in both cases, I think if we look a little closer, we can see that 2015, 2016 include a lot of women and children, and that right now, this perception of women and children also comes from the fact that men are forcefully kept from crossing the border due to conscription, and also where we just completely invisibilize those men that do come, and where we also do not talk about how vulnerable this status as women and children, how vulnerable that makes people who cross right now, where families are torn apart, where women and children and their parents often travel alone. So this makes it easier to create a more welcoming environment politically, but it creates a lot of problems in terms of the gendered insecurities that I was referring to earlier.
So maybe if you could make some sort of a recommendation, what should the EU be mindful of when they're welcoming these refugees, but at the same time they shouldn't be they should be mindful of certain things, not to, you know, make them like deprive them of agency, sort of.
Yes, but that is a general recommendation I would give, to not stereotype in gendered and racialized ways and in ageist ways. That also happens a lot, that this understanding of the elderly as vulnerable, but the youth, the young immigrants mostly as a problem. So all of these stereotypes, that is certainly something that should not be determining whether we enable migration or not. We should be enabling legal and safe routes for everyone, and we should have, as EU, as much as we can, a unified system of migration that does not enable this playing out of countries against each other and the unequal burden sharing that is happening in the EU right now. And then also rethink this understanding of vulnerability as a main way to understand who deserves protective status and who doesn't. Because vulnerability is a highly problematic concept, in my opinion, and it is now used to actually reduce the number of those that can access protection, and this is not very helpful, especially if we don't have any particular discussion around what vulnerability is and how we can measure it.
Maybe some question about prospects of EU migration policy or perceptions of migration. Do you think this situation with Ukrainian refugees will change it to the better?
I don't think so, because it plays exactly into the same narrative, that there are deserving and undeserving migrants, and that there are those that are like us, and that there are those that are not, and that automatically become suspect, and that automatically become associated with illegality, with crime, with terrorism, with the destruction of the European welfare state. So I think, sadly, as much as I'm happy to see that there's a change of policy, I fear that the discourse basically feeds into the very same discourse we've seen in 2015, and ironically even confirms it in some way.
Maybe to end this interview on a more positive or forward-looking note, maybe you can recommend some sources that our viewers or anyone who accesses this interview can look at. What should be consult apart from the mainstream media, maybe?
Well, if you're interested in Frontex, then Frontex Watch, State Watch, all of these critical sources provide a lot of insight into what is going on. In terms of media, all I can recommend is to diversify as much as you can, because we have seen, even in the most respected and established media, that a certain right-wing discourse has found its way in. So we need to listen to diverse voices, we need to listen to NGOs, we need to listen to academics and scholars, we need to listen to activists. And I'm happy to put together a few resources in the aftermath of the interview.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.